The click of bicycle wheels on cobblestone. A girl hums softly as she pedals through morning fog. Haarlem, 1943. The streets are quiet, unnaturally so. German soldiers patrol in pairs, their boots echoing off narrow canal houses. They barely glance at the teenager passing by, her blonde braids catching the weak sunlight. She looks like she belongs to a propaganda poster. Innocent, Aryan, safe. She isn't. In her wicker basket, beneath a folded newspaper and a loaf of bread, sits a loaded pistol. Freddie Overstegen is 14 years old, and she's hunting Nazis. The bicycle stops at a street corner. Freddie dismounts, adjusts her coat, and walks into a cafe where resistance members wait. They don't look like warriors. A shopkeeper, a teacher, a housewife. In occupied Holland, the battlefield doesn't announce itself. It hides in plain sight, behind ordinary faces doing extraordinary things. Freddie wasn't born into this war. She was shaped for it, long before the first German tank rolled across the Dutch border. Her mother, Trientje, was a communist, a believer in equality and justice who'd raised her daughters with iron principles. In their small apartment in Haarlem, there was never much food, never much money, but there was always room for one more refugee. Trientje sheltered Jews, fleeing persecution, hidden dissidents, anyone running from the Nazi machine. The Overstegen home became a safe house before there was even a formal resistance. Freddie grew up watching her mother defy the world. When neighbors whispered warnings about the risks, Trientje ignored them. When food grew scarce, she split what little they had. The lesson was clear. When people need help, you help. When evil shows itself, you resist. No exceptions, no excuses. The German occupation began in May 1940. The Netherlands fell in 5 days. The Dutch army, unprepared and outgunned, surrendered almost immediately. The Germans promised a light occupation, minimal interference. They lied. Within months, Jewish citizens were being registered, marked, segregated. Anti-Jewish laws multiplied. Businesses were confiscated, freedoms evaporated. The comfortable Dutch, who'd hoped to wait out the war in peace, discovered that neutrality wasn't an option. You either resisted or you collaborated. There was no middle ground. Trientje chose resistance immediately. She intensified her efforts, hiding more people, connecting with underground networks forming across the country. Freddie and her 16-year-old sister Truus helped without being asked. They delivered messages, carried supplies, learned to lie to German soldiers with straight faces. At ages 12 and 14, they were already part of the underground war. But in 1941, everything changed. A woman named Hannie Schaft appeared at their door. She was young, barely 20, with distinctive red hair that would later force her to dye it black for safety. Hannie was recruiting for something more dangerous than courier work. The Resistance Council had made a decision. Passive resistance wasn't enough. The Germans were executing civilians, deporting entire Jewish communities, tightening their stranglehold on Dutch life. Someone needed to fight back with force. Someone needed to kill Nazis. Hannie explained it without romanticism. This wasn't glorious. It wasn't safe. It would require shooting people at close range, watching them die, living with that weight forever. Many wouldn't survive. Those who did would carry scars that never fully healed. She needed people who understood the cost and were willing to pay it anyway. Freddie listened to every word. She was 14 years old. She should have been worried about school, about boys, about normal teenage concerns. Instead, she was calculating whether she had the courage to kill. The answer came quickly. She thought about the Jewish families she'd helped hide, the ones who'd been discovered and dragged away. She thought about the Dutch men executed for minor acts of defiance. She thought about her country bleeding under occupation. The courage wasn't the question, the necessity was the answer. Truus agreed immediately. The two sisters joined together, committed to whatever came next. Their mother knew. She understood the risks, understood she might lose both her daughters. But Treintje Overstegen had raised her children to fight injustice, and this was the fight of their generation. She let them go. The training began in scattered safe houses across the countryside. Freddie learned to handle weapons, to strip and reassemble pistols in the dark, to aim for center mass because you might not get a second shot. She learned to make explosives from household materials, to identify weak points in German vehicles and infrastructure. She memorized the faces of high-value targets, Nazi officers and Dutch collaborators whose deaths would save lives and disrupt operations. But the most critical training wasn't technical, it was psychological. She learned to compartmentalize, to separate the person she had to be from the person she wanted to be. She learned to flirt, to seem helpless, to play into every stereotype the Germans held about Dutch girls. She learned to kill someone while looking them in the eyes, then walk away without breaking stride. She learned that survival meant becoming someone else entirely, someone harder and colder than Freddie Overstegen had ever imagined being. Her first solo mission came within weeks. A Jewish family, hiding in Amsterdam, needed forged identity papers and ration cards. The documents were hidden in the false bottom of her bicycle basket, beneath legitimate groceries that would pass inspection. She had to cross 3 German checkpoints. If they found the papers, she'd be arrested, tortured for information about the resistance network, then executed. 14 years old and pedaling toward possible death. The first checkpoint went smoothly. The soldiers barely looked at her. The second was more thorough. They made her wait while they processed a long line of nervous civilians. Freddie kept her expression bored, slightly annoyed at the delay, exactly what a teenager running errands would feel. Inside, her heart hammered so violently she thought they'd hear it. They waved her through. The third checkpoint had a dog. Freddie hadn't prepared for that. The German shepherd sniffed at her basket, and she forced herself to stay calm, to keep breathing normally. The handler asked where she was going. She recited her prepared story, visiting an aunt in the next district, bringing groceries because her aunt was elderly and couldn't shop easily. The handler studied her face, looking for tells, for the micro-expressions that revealed lies. Freddie smiled politely and waited. After an eternity, he nodded and let her pass. She delivered the papers, saved that family, and pedaled home, shaking with delayed fear. That night, she couldn't sleep. She'd crossed a threshold. The theoretical danger had become viscerally real. She could have been arrested, could have been shot, could have given up resistance members under torture. The weight of it was crushing. But the next morning, when another mission came, she accepted it. And the one after that, and the one after that. Fear became familiar, something she carried but didn't let control her. The bicycle became her camouflage, her weapon, her escape route. Germans saw a teenage girl and dismissed her. That dismissal was lethal. The courier work continued for months. Freddie transported weapons hidden in her clothes, explosives wrapped to look like bread, messages that coordinated resistance operations across multiple cities. She developed a sixth sense for danger, learning to read German body language, to know when a checkpoint was running routine checks versus hunting for someone specific. She had close calls, moments when discovery seemed certain, but luck and quick thinking saved her each time. Then came the evolution. The resistance identified specific targets whose elimination would genuinely damage Nazi operations. A Gestapo officer known for torturing prisoners, a Dutch policeman who'd betrayed dozens of Jews to the Germans, an SS commander overseeing deportations. These weren't random soldiers. They were architects of atrocity, and their deaths would save lives. The problem was access. Adult resistance fighters couldn't get close. These men were paranoid, protected, suspicious of anyone who approached them. But a young woman, especially one who seemed frightened or attracted to them, that was different. The target's own prejudices and arrogance created the opening. They never imagined a teenage girl could be dangerous. Freddie and Truus developed the technique that became their signature. They'd identify the target, study his patterns, find moments when he was isolated or semi-isolated. Then they'd approach, usually at dusk or after dark, appearing lost or in need of help. The target would stop, confident and often predatory. Sometimes he'd offer directions. Sometimes he'd make inappropriate suggestions. Either way, he'd drop his guard completely. That's when Freddie would pull the gun. Sometimes from her coat, sometimes from her bag, always from somewhere the target never anticipated. She'd fire at close range, usually once to the chest, sometimes a second shot to be certain. Then she'd disappear, either on foot through prearranged escape routes or on her bicycle, pedaling away calmly while the target bled out behind her. The first assassination was in late 1943, a Gestapo officer known for particularly brutal interrogations. Freddie and Truus found him walking alone near the rail yards. Truus approached first, asking for directions. When he stopped and turned his attention to her, Freddie came from the side. She pulled the pistol and fired twice before he could react. They were gone before his body hit the ground, vanishing into the industrial district where they'd already planned 3 different escape routes. Freddie vomited afterward. The reality of killing someone, even a monster, was different from training. The man's face stayed with her, the surprise in his eyes, the way he'd crumpled. She'd taken a life. That weight was permanent and profound. But she also knew that man had tortured dozens of people, that his death meant fewer people would suffer. The moral calculus was brutal, but clear. She didn't stop. Neither did Truus. Together, sometimes with Hannie Schaft, they executed multiple high-value targets over the following months. Each operation was meticulously planned. They studied patrol routes, identified witnesses they'd need to avoid, prepared contingencies for every possible complication. The work required precision and nerves that never faltered. The psychological toll accumulated. Freddie lived in constant tension, never knowing if the next checkpoint would be the one where she was caught, if the next target would be faster with his own weapon, if a collaborator had infiltrated their cell and sold them out. She watched friends die, resistance members captured and executed. She attended funerals, sometimes for people whose real work couldn't even be acknowledged publicly. Between operations, she maintained the facade of normal life. She attended school when possible, though her attendance became sporadic. She helped her mother at home, smiled at neighbors, acted like a typical teenager. The compartmentalization was essential but exhausting. She was living multiple lives simultaneously, and none of them felt entirely real. The sabotage missions added another dimension. Freddie learned to cut communication lines that connected German command posts, disrupting their ability to coordinate responses to resistance actions. She helped plant explosives on rail lines, derailing supply trains heading to the Eastern Front. She participated in ambushes of German convoys, attacks that required split-second timing and absolute commitment. One operation involved liberating a transport truck carrying arrested resistance fighters. The Germans were moving them to a facility known for torture and execution. The resistance couldn't let that happen. Freddie helped set up the ambush on a rural road. When the truck approached, resistance fighters opened fire on the escort vehicles, while others forced the truck to stop. Freddie helped extract the prisoners and guide them to waiting vehicles. They saved 11 people that day, though 2 resistance fighters died in the firefight. The risks escalated constantly. The Gestapo grew more sophisticated, infiltrating cells, using double agents, breaking prisoners who gave up information under torture. Every operation could be a trap. Every new contact could be a spy. Paranoia became survival instinct. The resistance implemented stricter security protocols, compartmentalizing information so that captured members couldn't betray entire networks. Freddie and Truce survived through a combination of skill, caution, and luck. They varied their patterns, never using the same escape route twice, never meeting contacts in predictable locations. They developed recognition signals, code phrases that confirmed identities without requiring names. They learned to spot surveillance, to know when they were being followed, and how to lose tails without making it obvious they'd noticed. The winter of 1944 brought the Hunger Winter, the Hunger Winter. The Germans punished the Dutch resistance and support for the Allied forces by blocking food supplies to the Western Netherlands. Thousands starved. Freddie watched her community suffer, watched children grow skeletal, watched elderly people die from malnutrition. The brutality was deliberate, calculated to break Dutch morale. Instead, it hardened resistance resolve. When you're already dying, you have nothing left to lose. Freddie continued operating through the famine. Her missions took on additional urgency. Every Nazi officer killed, every supply train derailed, every operation that hurt the German war machine brought liberation closer. She was hungry, exhausted, running on determination and rage. But she didn't stop. In March 1945, Hannie Schaft was arrested. She'd been betrayed, likely by a Dutch collaborator who'd infiltrated the resistance. The Gestapo recognized who they'd captured, one of the most wanted resistance fighters in the region. They interrogated her brutally, trying to force her to reveal other resistance members. Hannie gave them nothing. 3 weeks before liberation, they executed her. Freddie learned about Hannie's death days later. The grief was overwhelming. Hannie had recruited her, trained her, fought alongside her. She'd been a hero, a friend, a symbol of everything the resistance stood for. Her death felt like a personal failure, even though Freddie knew there was nothing she could have done to prevent it. The war was cruel to the end. Liberation came in May 1945. Allied forces pushed into the Netherlands. German forces retreated or surrendered. And suddenly, the occupation was over. Freddie was 17. She'd spent 3 years killing, sabotaging, living in constant danger. Now she had to figure out how to live in peace. The transition was brutal. Post-traumatic stress wasn't recognized or treated. Freddie dealt with nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt. She'd lived when so many others died. She carried the weight of every person she'd killed, every friend she'd lost, every moment of terror that had defined her teenage years. There was no therapy, no support system designed for child soldiers who'd fought a guerrilla war. She tried to build a normal life. She married, had children, worked ordinary jobs, but the war never left her. She struggled with intimacy, with trust, with the ordinary frustrations of civilian life that seemed trivial after what she'd survived. Her marriage eventually ended. She rebuilt again, slower, more carefully. For decades, she didn't talk about her resistance work, partly because the memories were painful, partly because Dutch society didn't particularly want to hear about it. The country was rebuilding, looking forward, trying to forget the occupation years. Female resistance fighters were especially marginalized, their contributions minimized or erased by historians who focused on male military heroism. Freddie watched as her story, and the stories of thousands of women like her, disappeared from the official narrative. Only in the 1980s, when historians began actively seeking out surviving resistance members, did Freddie start sharing her experiences. She gave interviews cautiously, choosing her words carefully. She described operations in general terms, acknowledged her role in assassinations, but refused to provide specifics that would haunt her further. When asked how many people she'd killed, she always declined to answer. Some numbers, she believed, were too heavy to speak aloud. She was clear about her lack of regret. Not for fighting, not for killing Nazis. She regretted living in a world that made such actions necessary. She regretted the loss of her own innocence, the childhood that was stolen. But given the same circumstances, she'd make the same choices. Some evils must be fought with everything you have. In 2014, the Dutch government finally awarded Freddie and Truus the Mobilization War Cross, recognizing their extraordinary service to the resistance. The ceremony came nearly 70 years late, but it mattered. It was official acknowledgement that their fight had been real, legitimate, heroic. Freddie accepted the honor with quiet dignity, the same way she'd done everything else. She continued giving interviews in her final years, determined that younger generations understand what occupation meant, what resistance required. She spoke at schools, telling children about the dangers of authoritarianism, the importance of standing up to injustice even when it's terrifying. She wanted them to know that heroes don't look like propaganda posters. Sometimes they look like teenage girls on bicycles. Freddie Overstegen died in September 2018 at the age of 92. Her obituaries called her a war hero, a resistance fighter, one of the bravest women of her generation. All true, but they couldn't capture the full complexity of what she'd lived, what she'd done, what it had cost her. The bicycle remains central to her story, that perfect symbol of innocence, weaponized. The Germans saw transportation. Freddie saw opportunity. She used their assumptions against them, turned their prejudices into vulnerabilities, and struck before they understood what was happening. The bicycle gave her mobility, camouflage, and escape. It was her Trojan horse, hiding revolution in plain sight. Her legacy extends beyond her individual actions. She represented a phenomenon the Nazis never fully grasped. Resistance doesn't look like armies. It looks like ordinary people making extraordinary choices. It looks like mothers hiding refugees. It looks like teenagers with guns. It looks like shopkeepers sabotaging supplies. The occupation created heroes from unlikely sources, and those heroes fought a different kind of war. One without front lines or formal battles, but with stakes just as high. Freddie proved that age doesn't determine courage, that women are just as capable of combat as men, that the most effective warriors are sometimes the ones nobody suspects. She shattered assumptions while defending her country, and she did it with a combination of cunning, skill, and absolute commitment. The exact number of her kills remains unknown. She took that information to her grave. Maybe it was 5, maybe it was 20, maybe more. The number mattered less than what it represented: effective resistance against overwhelming power. Each target eliminated saved lives, disrupted operations, demonstrated that the occupation wasn't absolute. The Nazis could control territory, but they couldn't control the human spirit's refusal to submit. History remembers the grand campaigns, the famous generals, the decisive battles that shifted the war's momentum. But wars are also won by 14-year-old girls on bicycles, by acts of courage that never make official reports, by resistance that persists even when victory seems impossible. Freddie Oversteegen embodied that truth. She never revealed how many Nazis she killed because the specific number was never the point. The point was that she fought. The point was that when her country needed defenders, she became one. The point was that she refused to surrender to evil, even when evil seemed unstoppable. The point was that she carried the weight of her actions for the rest of her life without complaint, without seeking glory, without pretending it was easy. The bicycle wheels fade into silence. The fog lifts over Haarlem, revealing streets that have seen too much history. And somewhere in memory, a teenage girl keeps pedaling, keeps fighting, keeps reminding us that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it arrives with armies and tanks. Sometimes it arrives on a bicycle, carrying a girl with braids and a gun and courage that defies comprehension. She never backed down. She never gave up. She never stopped being the person her mother raised her to be. Someone who helps when people need help. Someone who fights when evil shows itself. No exceptions. No excuses. The story doesn't end with her death. It continues in every person who hears it and understands that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. It continues in the recognition that heroism doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It just acts. Freddie Oversteegen. 14 years old when she started hunting Nazis, 92 when she died, and in between, a lifetime of carrying weight that most people can't imagine. She was a child soldier, a resistance fighter, an assassin, a survivor, a hero. She was all of these things, and none of them fully capture who she was. What captures her best is the image that defined her war. A girl on a bicycle pedaling through occupied streets, carrying death in her basket and revolution in her heart. The Nazis never saw her coming. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. She'd already pulled the trigger and disappeared into the fog, another ghost haunting the occupation. Another reminder that control is always an illusion when people refuse to be controlled. The bicycle stands as her monument, more powerful than any statue. It represents the perfect fusion of innocence and lethality, of normalcy and resistance, of everything the Nazis couldn't comprehend about the people they tried to crush. They thought occupation meant submission. Freddie Oversteegen proved them wrong, one bullet at a time. For more true World War II stories and history, don't forget to subscribe to World War II Impact.